When you think of the oldest cities in the world, chances are you get images of ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia popping up in your head. Perhaps you may think of ancient Athens or Sparta, but you probably wouldn't think of the Americas. After all, the Americas are oftentimes referred to as the New World. And while that is true, the vast majority of settlements that the people live in the Americas today are by and large not that much older than a few centuries. There are some exceptions. Some that date back to pre-Columbian times. Even some that were set up by Europeans have histories that, while not old compared to the Middle East or even European standards, still have fascinating stories to tell. I'll point out that the written records in pre-Columbian North America are quite rare and pretty much non-existent in South America. So I'm not going to give specific dates for these cities' foundations. Due to the fact that much of the history is quite murky here before written records, it's hard to ascertain what was going on before Europeans arrived. So we have to pretty much look at ruins, pottery, and other archaeological evidence. Nonetheless, let's start with Cholula. And no, I'm not referring to the brand of hot sauce. I'm talking about a city, or more accurately, ruins near the city of Puebla. Puebla is most famous for its Baroque architecture and the Battle of Puebla between the Mexican government and France. However, many don't know that it's arguably one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the Americas, most likely dating back 4,000 years ago. Again, it is difficult to come up with a precise date. Most people outside of Mexico tend to associate pre-Columbian history with the Mayans and the Aztecs. However, this city is so old that the Mayans probably would have thought of it as ancient. It was first settled due to its mild climate, and a valley amongst mountain peaks that not only provided source of protection, but also rich mineral deposits and rich soil for growing maize. Maize is pretty much the staple crop of this part of the world, and on top of that, the soil was very useful for producing clay, which bricks and pottery could be made out of. Generally speaking, the history is quite murky around this time as stated before, so we don't really know the name of any of the chieftains or heads of state. It was most likely taken over by the Toltec culture during the Middle Ages, and eventually was taken over by the Triple Alliance, also known as the Aztec Empire. The three most famous cities of the Aztecs pretty much merged into one cohesive empire, with Tenochtitlan being the most important in what is now Mexico City. Now, while not suffering as badly from the Spanish conquest as other parts of Mesoamerica, this area did eventually succumb to Hispanic dominance and become the city of Puebla, built nearby overshadowing its pre-Columbian ruins, a common feature in many cities in Mexico to this day. Next on the list is Flores in Guatemala. This city has one of the coolest topographies, as it's situated on an island in the middle of a lake. However, it's far more obscure. It belonged to the Itza people, who were a group of ethnic Mayans native to the Patin region, and yes, my pronunciation is atrocious. It's worth noting that the Spanish first arrived here, but didn't actually conquer it. Hernando Cortez literally came to the city, but he didn't take it over. I'm assuming he wanted to win over the indigenous people to fight the Aztecs. Due to its geography, it was able to withstand much of the destruction, and it wasn't over a century later when the island and city eventually was taken over by the Spaniards. Monte Alban and Oaxaca are next on the list. Oaxaca has a very special place in my heart because I've actually been there, and it's probably my favorite city in Mexico. The Oaxaca Valley is quite possibly one of the most important regions of the world when it comes to food history. If you've ever eaten corn, chilies, avocados, chocolate, or turkey, or beans, or a variety of other foods native to Central America, then you have this region to thank for. The center of Zapotec culture was located here. The Zapotecs were one of those pre-Columbian civilizations that unfortunately have been largely forgotten, oftentimes overshadowed by the Aztecs and Mayans. It is probably for this reason that the most famous historical site that you see in Mexico is Chichen Itza rather than Mont Alban. The Zapotecs would eventually spread their influence towards what is now Mexico City near Tenochtitlan. I will keep in mind that my pronunciation is terrible, so please forgive me. However, the Zapotecs would eventually be outshined by Tenochtitlan itself, which would become Mexico City after the Spanish conquest. The Spanish would eventually settle the city of Oaxaca nearby, and it would remain a premier center of Mexican culture, celebrating the indigenous fusion culture with the Hispanic overlord culture. Next on the list is one that you probably won't expect to be on the list, as it resides north of the Rio Grande, and that is Tucson, Arizona. This is a little bit weird because we typically think of pre-Columbian cities as being in Mexico or Peru, not the United States. However, a lot of people don't know that there were a handful of settlements in what is now the United States, particularly in the southwestern United States before Columbus. This is rather unusual given the incredibly hot climate and the lack of rainfall. Nonetheless, the indigenous peoples here were very resilient. I'm assuming the main reason why this area had a disproportionate number of settlements compared to the rest of the United States is due to its relative close proximity to Mesoamerica, whereby ideas of complex civilizations could take root through trade networks. The Spanish would eventually arrive, and they didn't really settle Tucson first, and they preferred the area of what is now Santa Fe, Mexico, or Santa Fe, New Mexico. But then again, they didn't really care that much about the region. And to be honest, the Mexican Empire, which got its independence from Spain, didn't really care that much about the region either. The United States eventually took this place over after the Mexican-American War, but they didn't really care about it either. It wasn't until the advent of AC and irrigation in the second half of the 20th century when you really saw a large population emerge in the Southwest, including in Tucson, Arizona. Mexico City is next on the list, and it's the capital of, do I really need to say this? Mexico? It's the largest city in the Americas, famed for its beautiful cathedrals and very ugly traffic dynamics. This city was known as Tenochtitlán, the capital of the Aztecs during the days of the Triple Alliance. It was the most important of the three cities, and its topography was really cool, situated in the middle of a lake on an island with cool pyramids, temples, and canals. An advanced irrigation system that honestly puts the modern-day city of Mexico City to shame. However, the city really wasn't that old by global standards. It was only founded during the 1300s, before the Spaniards arrived. The pre-Hispanic city of Tenochtitlan had incredibly impressive urban planning by the standards of its time, with canals and vast monuments. The massive city of Mexico City is literally sinking at the moment due to the city's quench of thirst, and it doesn't help that it's located under a water table of what was once a giant lake. Next on the list is Cuzco. Cusco is a city in Peru, and it was the center of the Incan Empire and the cultural capital of much of Andean civilization. Now, it wasn't the first settlement done by this people group in this part of the world. Norte Chico is much older on the Pacific coast. However, the Incans would become the most famous as they were the last major empire in the Americas before Europeans arrived. This would not last long because while the Incans were famed for their great architecture and roads, they didn't have a writing system, and they were quickly defeated by the Spaniards who had superior military technology as well as some diseases. You also saw a synergy between the pre-Columbian beliefs of the Incans as well as the Franciscan Catholics, who were far more tolerant than the Dominicans. Now, let's move on to another part of the Americas, one that involves Europeans finally arriving. And that is the city of Santo Domingo, the capital and largest city in the Caribbean, located in the Dominican Republic on the island of Hispaniola, founded roughly around the same time as Christopher Columbus's landing on the area. He first landed in the Bahamas, but he was hopping around to find a better location. Eventually, the island of Hispaniola proved to be the best settlement location, and would be the first continuously inhabited European settlement in the New World. For all of his faults and failings, all of his triumphs and tribulations, this is where the modern history of the Western Hemisphere gets its start. However, it would eventually be overshadowed by Havana, Cuba, founded in 1519. The native Taino people on the island by and large lived in stateless societies, relying mainly on fishing, hunting, and gathering, and some basic forms of agriculture. When the Spanish arrived, it was quite easy to conquer them, oftentimes brutally with the help of some microorganisms. The city would eventually be a jumping-off point between Spain and the mainland of the Americas, and it was not a surprise that Hernando Cortez, the conqueror of the Aztecs, was once the former governor of Cuba. Eventually, Spanish interest in the Americas shifted towards the mainland, and the Caribbean became more of a proto-Wild West for many pirates and buccaneers. It is also unfortunate because a major point of slavery, namely the sugar plantations, came into fruition. In fact, when the South lost the American Civil War, many Confederates fled to Cuba. The island would gain its independence from the Spanish during the Spanish-American War and would be a de facto American vassal state until, in 1959, Fidel Castro along with his brother Raul would overthrow the Batista government, turning it into a quasi-communist authoritarian regime. Now, the Cold War is incredibly complex, and I'm not going to delve into that, but what is worth pointing out is that since the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba, by and large, has not really been a flashpoint in geopolitics, but rather a cool location to drink cheap beer and smoke cigars. Let's move on to Cumana, and yes, I'm mispronouncing it. This city is located in what is now Venezuela. It is the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in South America. After setting up shop in Mexico, the Spaniards would then move on to what is Panama City, on the Pacific coast. But they wanted a foothold in the southern continent, so they set up this little town. Now keep in mind, during colonial times, it became a significant port for sending raw materials to the Old World. In return, the Old World would send back manufactured goods in a system known as mercantilism. The most important people group in this city were known as the Creoles. These were Spaniards who were born in the Americas, in sharp contrast to the Peninsulares who were born in Spain proper. There were also mestizos who are a mix of Spanish and indigenous descent, but they by and large didn't have the same amount of power as the Creoles did. Eventually, the Creoles, and to a lesser extent the mestizos, would fight wars of independence in Latin America. The city eventually became overshadowed by Caracas as a result, which is not too far east. And this would set up the foundations of Latin American independence for a variety of nations. Let's move on to the next city on our list, Sao Vicente, which is the oldest Portuguese settlement in the Americas. The Portuguese actually started the exploration game before the Spaniards, but they were mostly focused on Africa and India. But they eventually found their way to Brazil. Now, Brazil is the largest country in Latin America, and the Portuguese would use this colony primarily for the production of lumber through Brazil wood. Brazil wood is where the country actually got its name. However, they didn't really care much about it for the most part at the beginning. The early days of this city would be rather sleepy. However, when Napoleon invaded the Iberian Peninsula, the monarchy of Portugal would flee to Brazil, and this would result in a massive outburst of immigration and population growth, primarily in other cities though. Despite being located on the Atlantic Ocean, the city would be quickly overshadowed by Sao Paulo, which is to the north and landlocked. Nonetheless, the city of Sao Vicente would eventually become a major seaport and tourist hub. Next on the list is the oldest city in what is now known as the US of A. A lot of American history books focus on Massachusetts and Virginia, but the reality is that the first Europeans to arrive in the United States were Spaniards arriving in Florida, setting up the city of St. Augustine. The Spaniards would eventually place more emphasis in the Southwest, setting up cities like Santa Fe, New Mexico, and moving into what is California, and they would by and large give up on their Floridian project, letting the Anglos take over much of what is now the United States. However, given the Mexican immigration issue, I think the Hispanics have ended up winning in the end. Despite being the oldest European settlement in the continental United States, St. Augustine today really isn't a city of any significant importance. It really is not much of a city at all. It's really just more of a settlement with 15,000 people. But I still recommend going there because they have a cool fort. So let's move on to the next one and really last city on our list. One that is probably not as cool to spend the winter time in, and that is Quebec City. This is the second largest city in the Canadian province of Quebec and is seen as the cultural capital of French Canada, as well as the official political capital of the province of Quebec. It was first settled by Jacques Cartier in 1535. Cartier was seeking a French foothold in the Americas, but knowing that much of the south was pretty much taken over by the Iberians, he thought of exploring the north through the St. Lawrence River. He was a pretty brutal man, but his successor, Samuel de Champlain, would found the city officially in 1608, and unlike his predecessor, he would forge fairly friendly relations with the indigenous people, oftentimes winning them over when it came to clashes with the British. These early settlements would lay the foundations of the Quebecois people, also known as French Canadians. The Quebecois date back to a handful of a few thousand French settlers, primarily from southwest France, many of whom belonged to the Basque ethnic group. There was actually an older city that was run by the French known as Port Royal in what is now known as Nova Scotia, however, it would be eventually abandoned. This would make Quebec City the oldest continuously inhabited French city in the Americas. Unfortunately for them, it didn't stay French forever, as the British would win the French-Indian War, also known as the wider 7 Years' War. However, in sharp contrast to virtually almost all of Canada, including what are large swaths of Montreal, the city of Quebec City is by and large Francophone and stays true to its Francophone identity. And there you have it. Those are some of the oldest and most interesting cities in the Americas. If you like this video, please subscribe. I'm going to be covering the oldest continuously inhabited cities in sub-Saharan Africa next.